You know, back in the early 1990s, New York City was haunted by a ghost from the past. A killer popped up who was copying one of the most famous unsolved cases in history. But his reign of terror didn't end with some brilliant detective work. Nope. It ended with a shocking, almost ridiculously simple mistake that completely exposed the man behind the myth.
I am the Zodiac. I am in control. I mean, can you imagine? That's the chilling message sent to the New York police. A direct throwback to the taunts that terrified San Francisco decades earlier. It was all about projecting power, sowing fear, and for a long, long time, it absolutely worked.
So where did this nightmare even begin? Well, this new killer, who was clearly obsessed with the original Zodiac, starts this string of attacks all over the city. It threw people into a total panic and kicked off one of the biggest manhunts in New York's history.
And the similarities were just terrifying. The copycat used the same MO, coded letters, taunting the police, the whole deal. But there was one huge difference. The original San Francisco Zodiac's motive, still a total mystery. But this new guy, he was very clear. It was all about astrology. He was picking his victims based on their star signs.
For years, the NYPD was just chasing a ghost. This guy was so careful, leaving behind practically zero evidence. He would strike, then go silent for months, even years, making it impossible to predict or profile him. He was a phantom.
And just look how long he was active. The first attack hit in March 1990, and the last known one wasn't until October of '93. That's more than 3 years of terror. 3 years of people living in fear, with these long, quiet stretches that just made everyone wonder, when is he going to strike next?
And here's the real human cost of his so-called cosmic mission. 3 people lost their lives, and several others were critically wounded, all because of his twisted obsession with astrology. In his mind, this wasn't just random violence. He was on some kind of sick, divinely guided quest.
He really thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He built these homemade zip guns because they don't leave rifling marks on the bullets, a detail he proudly pointed out, thinking it made him untraceable. He sent these elaborate codes and truly believed the stars made him invincible. He was convinced he had created the perfect, unsolvable crime spree.
And then, everything changes. Summer of 1996. The massive, citywide manhunt grinds to a halt. Not because of a clever detective or a forensic breakthrough, no. It's all because of a messy, violent domestic dispute in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn. So, meet the man behind the terrifying mask, Heriberto Seda. Not some criminal mastermind, not a genius. An unemployed high school dropout living at home with his mom and sister, with a bad temper. The difference between the myth he built and the reality of his life is just staggering.
And this is how it all came crashing down. It wasn't some grand plan, it was his own out-of-control rage. He gets into a fight, threatens his half-sister and her boyfriend, and then actually shoots his sister in the back as she's trying to get away. Then, he locks himself in the apartment, and after a long standoff with police, he just gives up. A pathetic, common crime. But it was the key that unlocked everything.
So, when the police hauled Heriberto Seda in for shooting his sister, they had absolutely no clue who they were dealing with. To them, it was just another domestic violence case. They were just going through the motions. Until one tiny, almost throwaway detail changed the entire investigation. It was the Zodiac's calling card, that unique symbol, that crosshair that he put on every single one of his taunting letters. Well, after his arrest, while he's writing out his confession for shooting his sister, what does Heriberto Seda do? He draws that exact same symbol right at the bottom of the page. An unbelievable, arrogant mistake.
And that was it. That was the moment. One sharp investigator looking over the statement sees that symbol and recognizes it from the Zodiac task force files. And just like that, in an instant, the ghost they'd been chasing for years suddenly had a name and a face. It was the kind of break you just can't make up.
So once they had him, his whole myth just collapsed. Remember those so-called untraceable zip guns he was so proud of? Well, here's the beautiful irony. He was right. They didn't have rifling. But because they were so crudely made, they left unique tool marks on every single bullet. Forensics took one look and perfectly matched the bullets from the murder scenes to the guns they found in his apartment. The very thing he thought made him a genius became his undoing.
And from there, the evidence just started piling up. It was like a snowball rolling downhill. Handwriting experts confirmed the writing on his confession was a strong match to the Zodiac letters. Then, they even managed to lift his fingerprints off some of the notes he'd sent years before. The walls were closing in, and fast.
And then came the final nail in the coffin, the one thing he could not possibly explain away: DNA. A tiny bit of his saliva, left on a postage stamp he licked to mail one of those taunting letters to the police, was a perfect match to Heriberto Seda. That's it. Checkmate. The case was completely sealed.
With a mountain of evidence against him, the man who called himself the Zodiac was finally brought to justice, and his end was just as pathetic as his real life, completely stripped of the mystery and terror he'd worked so hard to wrap himself in.
I mean, you can't even fathom the arrogance. Turns out he'd been arrested before for carrying one of his zip guns, but the charges got dropped. And he didn't see that as a lucky break. Oh no. He took it as a literal omen, proof that he was special, that he was beyond consequences.
In court, that mask of the cool, calculating killer just completely shattered. He couldn't keep up the act. He was constantly having these angry outbursts, shouting at the judge, disrupting everything. It revealed the truth. This wasn't a mastermind. This was just an angry, powerless man lashing out.
And in the end, this was the one consequence he couldn't escape. Heriberto Seda was found guilty and sentenced to 232 years in prison. A number that makes one thing crystal clear: the man who called himself the Zodiac will never, ever be free again.
So it all makes you wonder, what is the true face of a monster? The New York Zodiac wanted everyone to see him as this mythic, untouchable phantom. But his story shows us something else, doesn't it? That sometimes the monster behind the mask isn't some brilliant evil genius, but just a petty failure brought down by nothing more than his own simple, uncontrollable rage.